Okay, we're on Antiquity Unveiled. I guess this is page one. After the content section, we're going to do the tribute, memoir, the compiler's preface, which makes up the first part of the preface. So we're going to do preface, first part of the preface. But anyway, here we go. Tribute to J.M. Roberts, Esquire. This is by Forrester Gordon. Goes, faithful soldier of light, whose buckler is an honest soul. The sword of truth, in lustre bright, gleams in thy hand. Still onward roll the waves of battle, yet the shafts of hate are vain before the radiant shield that guards thee still. Thy glorious fate will be to conquer, not to yield 1 inch of ground to adverse force, but, marching on to triumph high, o'er error prostrate, left with no resource, whilst thou can banded hosts defy, knowing that right shall yet succeed, and thou, O soldier staunch and true, shalt reap reward for every deed and word of faith. For such thy due, and in thy spirit home shall shine thy record fair, inscribed by angels' hands, who to thee bring in flux of light divine. And it was written January 14th, 1885 by Forrester Gordon. Says here, the above lines were inscribed to one whose lamp of mortal life went out while he battled for the truth. None were more valiant or fearless in its defense. He could suffer, but never yield to wrong, for his soul was cast in the mold from which martyrs are born. He fell on the field of battle, full armored and face to the foe, leaving others to grasp truth's standard. Close up the ranks and press on to victory. Indeed we will. And here is the memoir of Jonathan M. Roberts, Esquire. It is only natural that the readers of this volume should desire to know something of the life and characteristics of the individual whose intellectual labors contributed so much to its value. The earnestness and sincerity were marked elements of his character. No one could doubt, who heard him speak or read the lines from his pen. To illustrate, we quote the following from one of his editorials. Quotes, Dear friends and patrons, it is true that we have not known what rest or recreation was during the daily and nightly vigils which we have been forced to keep. But what of that? Who is there that is worthy to serve truth, who is not willing to forget self in the grander purpose of contributing to the common good of mankind? End quote. His was a life full of usefulness, and his good deeds were many. When his great soul had outgrown its mortal surroundings, and the measure of his earthly life was filled, he passed on to the other fields of labor in the spheres beyond, leaving this world better for having lived in it. Jonathan M. Roberts, Esquire, was born in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, December of 1821, and was a man of fine education as well as well-marked ability. He studied law and practiced it for some years, from which he retired previous to his taking up the editorial pen. Prior to the war, he was an active abolitionist, and being a man of strong temperament and positive convictions, he became one of the leaders of that party. Subsequently, he became an active Republican and spoke effectively during several campaigns. About 1873, he was convinced of the truth of spiritualism through receiving communications from his father, who, when in earth life, was prominent in national affairs and a member of the U.S. Senate. In 1878, Mr. Roberts started Mind and Matter, a weekly journal devoted to the interests of spiritualism. As its able editor, gained a well-earned reputation as a journalist and writer. He was a great student in ancient religious history and made extensive researches therein, prompted by the revelations received from many ancient and modern spirits. Thus, amidst his untiring labors for the good of others, he passed to the spirit life February 28, 1888, at his home in Burlington, New Jersey, in the 67th year of his age. Okay, and here we have part one of the compiler's preface. In submitting to the reader Antiquity Unveiled, it is with a feeling of assurance that its contents will answer this all-important and oft-repeated question: is Christianity, as known and taught in the Western world, a divinely inspired religion, or an offspring of still more ancient religions? Every unprejudiced student knows that notwithstanding the many claims made by Christian writers as to the origin of Christianity, it still remains simply a formidable religious system whose source is buried in the debris of remote antiquity. The revelations contained in Antiquity Unveiled are destined to unearth and solve all the great mysteries surrounding the origin of the Christian religion. For the unlearned and student alike, it appears from the testimony set forth in the following passages that fragments of teachings, forms, and dogmas were gathered from various religious systems that were extant previous to the so-called Christian era and gradually molded into what is known and taught as Christianity. The formulators of this system employing every means to disguise its pagan origin. This work contains a series of messages from occult sources bearing upon Oriental religions and their relation to Christianity, with comments thereon by the late J.M. Roberts, Esquire. The following is a brief account of the manner in which these messages were received. On March 26, 1880, Mr. Roberts, then editor of Mind and Matter, received a communication through the medium from Potamon, the founder of the eclecticism, which was the beginning of the series. This was followed by others upon the same subject until the entire series was finished in 1886. All were published in a weekly journal as received. They contain in small space a vast amount of knowledge pertaining to the religious history of mankind, which before this unfoldment was unknown to the world. It is these revelations of such great import to every individual that we place before our readers. The object of publishing these important and startling revelations is not only because they are of universal interest, but to preserve them to the world as well as meet the popular demand of progressive minds in every clime, C-L-I-M-E. The corroborative evidence embraced therein demonstrates conclusively that Apollonius of Tyana was the Jesus of Nazareth, the so-called Savior of the Christian Scriptures. This great teacher now returns to earth and inspires a medium through whom he explains the mysteries which have surrounded the origin of so-called Christianity. These facts being so highly important, it seems imperative that they should be widely disseminated. Therefore, we have concluded to issue them in a volume entitled Antiquity Unveiled. The work would have been published by Mr. Roberts in book form had he remained in earth life a few years longer and received the encouragement and support he was entitled to in view of the great work he was called upon to fulfill for the enlightenment of mankind. We cannot hope to compile the work so completely and ably as Mr. Roberts would have done, he being fully prepared with all the details, as well as possessing marked ability and wonderful adaptation for such a task. The only thing which now seems possible in view of the demise of Mr. Roberts is to insert the communications in the order they were received, as far as practical, and as much of his comments as the size of the volume will admit. These will rest upon their merits as bearing upon the religious history of the world. The work will at least be suggestive of thought, and cause many minds to look below the surface of present religious teachings. A considerable number of publications have been brought to the attention of the reading world hereto by able authors and scholars upon the subject of ancient religions. These works, however, have been based upon what history of past ages has not been destroyed and is now accessible, and such researchers as could be made at a time so remote from the age in which these religions had their origin. Other works have been published within the last 12 years, whose authors who have had the opportunity to draw facts and data from these communications and comments, which have been in print since 1880, and therefore accessible as sources of information upon the subject since that date. While it is gratifying to know that other writers have seen their value and importance, it is only just to the authors of these spirit messages, as well as to Mr. Roberts, in view of his exhaustive labors in the field of research, that we accord them due credit by placing on record the time when they were first received and published. This work differs from all others preceding it from the fact that it is dependent upon history only so far as to identify the individuals giving the communications and to bring to notice collateral facts bearing upon their testimony. Instead of the conflicting statements of history, we have the corroborative testimony of spirit life of those who were conspicuous instead of the conflicting statements of history, we have the corroborative testimony from spirit life of those who were conspicuous in the ancient history of our world. Some of these distinguished individuals were the leading lights in the propagation of the ancient religions from which the teachings of Christianity were borrowed. Others of their number lived at and subsequent to the date of the Christian era, and testify definitely as to the part they acted in the origination and promotion of Christianity, as formulated from ancient religions. Many of these witnesses now return and contradict the assertions of Christian writers, viz., that they taught and upheld Christianity while on earth. Others testify that they have learned in spirit life the fallacy of the teachings of Christianity. Still others testify, as they did in earth life, that they knew the teachings of Christianity were not in accord with the truth, but were composed fragments gathered from the decayed religions of the past, and molded by skillful minds into the shape best suited for their purpose, after which all traces of their ancient origin were destroyed as far as possible, that they might appear as a direct inspiration from God. Hence, we cannot expect to find the root of the Christian religion at the comparatively recent date of 1800 years ago, but back through the dim vista of the Oriental ages. Many of these spirit witnesses, it appears, fearing for their lives, withheld the truth while on earth, but return and divulge it now. A few of them only were unwilling witnesses, who finally yielded to the force of truth and rendered their testimony. We know of none more competent to testify that these vital questions than those who were the religious teachers at the periods before mentioned. Some of our readers may discredit the source of these communications, but this does not dispose of the subject matter. The testimony remains, backed up not only by the truth which underlies it, but by the collateral facts of history. Therefore, whatever the source, this mass of evidence must be met, if at all, on the basis that the logical and reason to which the subject is entitled. Others, without due consideration or the ability to comprehend the great and interesting questions involved, may consider the work a fiction. If so regarded, it must be admitted that it is a fiction of such ponderous proportions as to be unequaled in the field of romance. On the other hand, if it bears the scrutiny of reasonable mind and proves to be generally true, it must then be conceded that the pages of this volume chronicle the most wonderful and startling revelations given to the world in any century of its history. Though Mr. Roberts was a well-read man of great intelligence, he had heard of but very few of the authors of these spirit communications until they introduced themselves to him through the medium. He was, therefore, greatly surprised at receiving such startling historical disclosures, and found it necessary to continually refer to encyclopedias, biographical dictionaries, etc., in order to establish their identity and obtain as much evidence as possible of the correctness of their statements. This required the labors and research of years. Many of the historical sketches of these spirits had to be translated from other languages into English, and in cases where there were no historical records extant, their statements had to be tested by the light of collateral evidence. In these revelations are pointed out many instances where historical records have been so mutilated by Christian writers and others in the interest of Christianity that they are entirely unreliable as to the true historical records. Reference is given in connection with each communication where historical evidence may be found, that the critical reader may search for himself. From the fact that the translation was necessary in so many instances, the idea is precluded, which some might entertain, that the medium could have originated these communications. Even if he had been a great scholar and equal to the task of translation, there remains to be accounted for the many corrections made, the missing links furnished, as well as the masterly manner in which some of these ancient scholars expose the mutilations of history and settle questions that have caused much controversy among historical writers. No scholar living on earth at present day, however learned, unaided by spirit intelligence, could thus have laid bare the facts in this connection, and certainly not one who, as an individual, was a marked illustration of how the ignorant and unlettered are chosen by the powers that be. Let me just read that again. No scholar living on earth at present day, however learned, unaided by spirit intelligence, could have thus laid bare the facts in this connection, and certainly not one who as an individual was a marked illustration of how the ignorant and unlettered are chosen by the powers that be to confound the wise. The spirit messages are given verbatim as received, but the biographical references are inserted in a few instances only, as it would make the volume too large. For a similar reason, the comments of Mr. Roberts are only partially included. Enough of the latter, however, are given to show the reader how deeply and entered into this vast subject and also give him some idea of the labor required to consummate this work. At many of these sittings, other individuals in company with Mr. Roberts were present. Hence, there is no lack of evidence that the communications were received through the medium and carefully recorded. During the time these interviews were in progress, many questions were put to the spirits which were suggested by their statements. These were answered with a promptness and a facility which proved their ability to elucidate, elucidate, any point bearing upon the subject under consideration. If the medium had been simply a pretender, instead of a passive instrument under spirit control, these questions would have remained unanswered. Some readers of this work, not knowing the essential facts connected with its history, and moved by their prejudices born of a false education, may attempt to make it appear that the contents were produced through collusion between Mr. Roberts and the medium, regardless of their misleading effects. No greater mistake could be made. From the evidence herein set forth, it appears that too much collusion has already been practiced by the church authorities in the past for the good of mankind, the evil of which seems now in a fair way to be corrected by witnesses from whose testimony there can be no appeal. In regard to Mr. Roberts, no shadow of suspicion could reflect upon him as to collusion in this manner, for he was known to be a man of the highest integrity, whose record would bear examination even by his opponents. His ability, scholarly attainments, intelligence, and earnestness, evinced in his exhaustive labors upon this subject to discover the truth, are apparent throughout the entire work. Those who are unfamiliar with this mode of spirit intercourse will scarcely comprehend the difficulties to be surmounted before these spirits were able to accomplish their self-imposed task. It seems marvelous to those who understand the laws governing these manifestations that these spirits should be able to return and deliver so coherently this vast array of evidence while controlling a physical organism so unlike their own ethereal organism. The consistency with which these individuals who lived on earth, not only in the remote ages of antiquity, but down through the centuries, present their testimony, every vital part in coherence with the other, is among the most remarkable events in the history of our world. In this instance, the difficulties were largely augmented by the presence of a great opposing force from the spirit side, composed of those who from the very inception of the Christian religion have been engaged in promulgating its teachings, borrowed from the heathen mythology and galvanized with the name of sentimentalism of Christianity. These revelations reaching the world meant annihilation of the power they had gained. Therefore, every obstacle they could control was placed in the way to prevent their translation. These witnesses were mostly the learned men of their time, embracing rulers, prophets, and historians. They stepped to the front in the 19th century to reflect light on history's pages by pointing out the criminal errors caused by interpolation and elimination, thus showing how the records of the past have been mutilated and the truth misrepresented for selfish ends. In doing this, they have fearlessly laid bare the parts where personal ambition has promoted changes foreign to the truth and misleading to mankind. The light they bring includes not only what they acquired on earth, but also the clear knowledge gained in spirit life. Now, in view of the many opposing factions in the religious world, each claiming to be right, many minds have doubtlessly questioned why this testimony as to the truth concerning the great religious questions which so agitate the human mind has been deferred so long. Why, if the lines of communication were open between the two worlds, the philosophers, teachers, and learned men of old, who are in touch with these matters of such vast importance, have not returned ere this to dissipate the fearful delusions which envelop humanity. To close, readers of the history of man's spiritual unfoldment, it must be evident that these revelations were brought to the attention of the world as soon as the state of man's growth enabled him to comprehend and embrace them. That the great and good in the spirit realms have been struggling for centuries through adverse conditions to consummate this task, no unprejudiced reader can doubt. That they have failed many times in the past is equally true. Consequently, all efforts in that direction had to be abandoned from time to time until man had progressed to a condition which rendered success possible. Destiny, it appears, awarded that period to the latter part of the 19th century. We need not apologize to our readers for the length of the preface. On a subject of such vast importance, with so many points to be considered, even this space we have taken does not afford scope to embrace them all. Okay, and that was Antiquity Unveiled. That was, what's that? The Tribute, the Memoir, and part one of the compiler's preface.